Awakened by fear. The woman's nightmarish journey. Hook. What if everything you've ever known is a lie? Imagine waking up in a place you don't recognize, feeling an eerie presence you can't escape, and hearing a pulse that connects you to something terrifying. What happens when the darkness doesn't let go? Stay with us until the end. You won't believe what happens next. Prepare yourself for a journey you'll never forget. She awoke to the sound of something soft, barely audible, a whisper in the dark. A strange feeling lingered in the air, thick, oppressive. She blinked, her eyes adjusted. The room was unfamiliar, cold. A dim light filtered in from somewhere, casting long shadows against the walls. The sheets tangled around her legs, cold and stiff. She reached out, but her fingers brushed against something rough. The surface was hard. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. There was a shape by the window, tall, thin. Her heart skipped. She swallowed hard. The figure didn't move. A sudden chill swept over her, making her shiver. The room smelled of damp earth and decay. Her eyes scanned, wide and frantic, searching the corners. No sound, only silence. The seconds dragged on. Then a soft scuff of a footstep. Slow, purposeful. She gasped, sitting up. Her pulse quickened. Where was she? Why couldn't she remember? The figure at the window had not moved, but the air, it felt wrong. A weight, pressing down on her chest. She tried to call out. Her throat tightened. No words. The silence thickened, suffocating her. The figure was closer now. She could feel it. The coldness radiated off it. A shiver ran down her spine. Her hands shook as she reached for the bedside lamp. It flickered, then went out completely. Total darkness. Her breath quickened. The room was suffocating now. She needed to leave, but her legs, they wouldn't move. They felt like stone. She clenched her fists. Desperation clawed at her. A whisper, faint, but unmistakable. Her name. It was her voice, but not her mouth. She gasped again. The figure was no longer by the window. It was standing next to her bed. She could feel it, its presence looming. Something cold brushed against her skin. Her whole body tensed. A sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped, unable to breathe. It was all around her. The darkness, the cold, the weight. The pressure on her chest increased. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. A loud, sickening crack echoed in her ear. Then nothing. The silence was deafening. Her eyes shot open. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The room was still dark, but it was different. The weight had lifted. The pressure was gone. She blinked, confused. Everything felt too quiet, too empty. She sat up slowly, her limbs heavy. The bed was warm beneath her, but the air, still thick with that strange heaviness, made her skin crawl. She turned her head. No figure, no shape in the corner, but the feeling, it lingered. A soft sound, distant, like something scraping against the wall. She froze. The noise came again, louder this time. Closer. A rhythmic scraping. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, feet brushing the cold floor. Her toes curled into the frigid surface. A hollow, echoing silence filled the room. Nothing seemed real. The scraping continued. Now she could hear it moving along the floor, coming toward her. Her heart raced. Her skin crawled with every second. She reached for the door. Her hand gripped the handle. But the scraping was louder now. Closer. It was almost at her feet. She yanked the door open. But the scraping followed, unrelenting. She stepped into the hallway, eyes scanning the dark space. The air smelled stale, like something had died here long ago. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places. She heard the sound again, Closer. It was right behind her now. She whipped around. Nothing. She could feel its presence, though. Close. The scraping had stopped, but something new filled the space. A low, guttural breath. She froze again. It came from the dark corner of the hallway. Slow, deep breaths. Too close. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She moved backward, step by step, and then a sudden, sharp screech pierced the silence. Her heart jumped in her chest. The air turned icy. Her breath turned to mist. The figure was there in the dark, standing motionless, its form barely visible in the dim light. But the eyes, she saw them, glowing empty, a pair of hollow voids. They stared right into her soul. She couldn't move. The eyes, those dark, empty eyes, burned into her. Her body felt like stone, frozen in place. A pulse of terror shot through her chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her throat closed tight, strangled by fear. The air grew colder, sharper. She could see her breath now, rising in clouds before her face. The floor beneath her feet felt slick, as if the wood had turned to ice. Her body trembled, and then it stepped forward, slowly, with purpose. The scraping sound returned, faint at first, but unmistakable. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Her heart pounded. She was trapped. There was no escape. The figure moved closer, its form growing clearer in the dim light. It was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bone. The breath came again, slow and deliberate. It smelled of rot, decay, a stench that made her stomach churn. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. The distance between them closed with every breath she took. Her hands, cold and shaking, reached for anything. The wall. Her fingers brushed against the rough texture of the peeling wallpaper. The figure was inches away now. She could feel the cold radiating from it. A voice, soft and raspy, whispered from the darkness. "You should not have woken." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her body stiffened. A cold hand, impossibly cold, grazed her arm. She recoiled, but the grip tightened. The fingers were long, too long, digging into her skin. A flash of light, like a flickering candle, came from the far end of the hallway. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure, though. It didn't move. Its grip remained tight. The darkness seemed to swirl around her, closing in. And then it spoke again, this time louder. "Now you belong." Her chest tightened. Her vision blurred. The hallway spun around her. The world tilted. And everything went black. She awoke again. But this time, everything was different. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of mold and mildew. Her body felt cold, almost numb. She struggled to open her eyes. Her vision blurred at first. When her sight cleared, she was lying on a stone floor. The walls were damp, covered in shadows that seemed to move. The room was small, suffocating. A low hum filled the space, like machinery. But there was no machinery, only the soft drip of water somewhere in the distance. She pushed herself up, her muscles aching. Her skin was still cold, clammy. Her hands trembled as they braced against the floor. The air felt wrong, as if it wasn't meant for her to breathe. She looked around. The stone walls were bare, no windows. Only a single door on the far side. She stood up shakily, her legs weak beneath her. The door. She needed to reach it. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her feet felt heavy. The hum grew louder. The closer she got to the door, the more the air seemed to twist, as if something was pressing against it, holding it shut. She reached for the handle, her fingers barely brushing it. A sudden jolt of electricity shot up her arm. She gasped, pulling away. The door was alive. She stepped back. Then she heard it. A low, distorted whisper, like the wind through broken glass. "You cannot leave." Her breath caught. Her heart thudded in her chest. She spun around. The room. It was changing. The shadows stretched, twisted. The walls seemed to bend inward. The air became thick, suffocating. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened. The whispers grew louder. More voices now. They surrounded her. They were everywhere. In her head. Outside the room. She couldn't tell where they came from. But one voice stood out. The same voice. The one that had spoken to her before. "You shouldn't have woken." Her body was shaking uncontrollably. She stumbled backward. And then a cold, familiar hand, reached out from the shadows. It was long, thin. The skin was stretched tight, too tight. Her breath hitched. The hand gripped her wrist with an iron strength. And then the voice came again. "Now you belong." A sharp pain seared through her chest. Her vision blurred once more. And the room went black. She gasped for air, her lungs burning. But there was no air, only suffocating pressure. Her chest ached as if her heart had stopped beating. The darkness surrounded her, heavy and oppressive. And yet there was movement, a shift in the shadows, a whisper, closer now, crawling over her skin. "You are ours now," it hissed. Her head snapped toward the sound. The hand that had gripped her wrist was still there, tight and unyielding. Its fingers dug deeper into her flesh. She tried to pull away, but it held her fast. She tugged again, harder this time. The pain was unbearable. Her skin burned where it touched. The shadows around her swirled, thickening. She couldn't see, only feel, everything closing in. And then the whispers came, all at once. Thousands of voices, each one rasping and choking, a cacophony of agony. Her mind screamed in protest. Her body trembled, fighting the pull of whatever was in the darkness. And then a sharp, cruel laugh pierced through the noise. The laugh was hollow. It rattled her bones. A figure emerged from the shifting blackness. A silhouette, its form tall and looming. The same figure from the window from the hallway. Its face was a blur, a distortion of pale, stretched skin. And those eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, they glowed with an unnatural light. And they stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You are here now," it whispered, its voice too familiar. Her throat was dry. She couldn't speak. Her body felt disconnected from her mind, numb and trapped. The room around her seemed to pulse, alive, with the dark energy that now consumed her. The figure took a step forward, closer, the space between them shrinking. The air grew colder. The walls pressed in tighter. She could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and suffocating. "You will never leave," the figure rasped. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight. But all she could do was stand there, frozen. The shadows tightened their grip around her. And then she felt it. A sharp, unbearable cold pierced through her chest. She gasped in agony. The figure smiled, a twisted, sickening smile. "You belong here with us." And then everything went silent. The darkness swallowed her whole. For a long moment, there was nothing. Complete silence. The cold still clung to her skin, suffocating her. But something shifted. A pulse. A faint, distant thrum of life, of motion. Far beyond the endless blackness. It was like a heartbeat. Slow. Lifeless. But it was there, and it called to her. She tried to move, but her limbs felt like lead. The shadows had become her prison, trapping her inside this suffocating space. Yet the pulse, the beat, it grew louder, and somehow she could feel it deep inside her, in her bones, in her soul. She knew it wasn't a sound. It was something much worse, something alive, something that had been waiting for her. She breathed in, though it hurt to do so. The coldness stung her lungs. Her heartbeat raced as she realized she was not alone. The walls trembled with the sound of something large, something heavy, and then a whisper, not the voices that had surrounded her before. This was different. A voice, clear, sharp. "You're waking up." She jerked her head toward the sound, but there was no one, just the endless void. The voice came again, closer now. "You're waking up. Too soon." Her body tensed. Her hands twitched, fingers clawing at the blackness around her. Her breath grew ragged. The heartbeat. It was faster now, closer. She felt the presence behind her, like the air itself had taken form. A figure loomed in the darkness, tall, shifting. It was waiting, watching. She tried to call out, but no words left her mouth. The pressure around her chest tightened, choking her. A laugh, hollow and empty, echoed in her mind. "You were never meant to wake." The shadows seemed to close in tighter, curling around her. Her legs buckled beneath her, the weight of the room pressing her to the floor. But the pulse, it was growing stronger. The thrum vibrated through her body now, an unsettling rhythm that filled every corner of her being. Something was coming, something terrible. The room began to shift. The walls closed in, bending, warping. A sickening crack sounded in the distance. She forced herself to look up, and then she saw it. The figure. It had stepped closer, and now its eyes locked with hers. Those hollow, lifeless eyes. The pulse grew faster. The figure smiled. "Now you're part of it." Her vision blurred. The room spun, and as the heartbeat pounded louder, the shadows twisted and closed in. Everything around her faded to black, and then nothing. She was drifting, weightless. Her mind teetered on the edge of consciousness, grasping at something distant. A flicker, a spark. But the darkness was overwhelming. It pressed against her, suffocating her with its cold embrace. She tried to scream, but there was no sound. Only the pulse, the beat. It still throbbed within her, steady and relentless. Closer now, but then something changed. A sharp, searing pain pierced through her chest. Her body jerked, and her eyes snapped open. She gasped for air, but it was shallow, too shallow. The room around her, it wasn't the same. The walls were no longer stone. Now they were twisted metal, cold and sharp. Her body was lying on something hard, metallic. Her fingers dug into the surface beneath her, finding jagged edges. It was a cage. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she looked around. There was no escape. The pulse, that infernal pulse, still echoed in her head. It was everywhere. The walls, the floor, her own body. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to block it out. But then, a soft breath against her ear. A whisper. "Did you think it was over?" Her body stiffened. The voice was close, too close. It had been there watching her. She felt the presence before she saw it, looming over her. The figure was back, its pale, twisted form bent over the cage, its eyes glowing with that same sickening light. "You're mine now," it rasped. She scrambled backward, her hands clamoring against the metal bars, but they were unyielding. The air around her grew colder. Her chest ached with every shallow breath. And then she saw it, the source of the heartbeat. In the far corner of the cage, something moved. It was a mass of shadows, shifting and writhing. A tangled mess of limbs, eyes. It was growing, expanding, and then it stopped. Still, silent. And from the blackness came another whisper. "You belong to the dark now." Her throat burned as she tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The pulse grew louder, closer. The walls began to close in again. But this time, it wasn't the walls. It was the shadows. They stretched toward her, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her into the center. The figure watched. It smiled. "You are part of it now." The darkness closed in, suffocating her. And just as the pulse reached its deafening crescendo, everything went still. The world around her disappeared. She could feel nothing, nothing but the void. It stretched on, endless and cold. Her body was gone, no form, no weight, just darkness. But then a flicker, a light. It was small at first, a glimmer in the distance. Weak, shimmering. She reached for it, instinctively, though she had no body to move. It called to her. It was a promise, a way out. The light pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. Soft, steady. Closer now. She felt the tug, like gravity pulling her toward it. Her mind struggled to follow. But with every passing moment, she could feel herself moving, rising. And then the light grew brighter, blinding. She had no choice but to let it consume her. For an instant, everything vanished. And then a sudden, sharp pain. Her lungs burned as air rushed into them. She gasped like a drowning person coming up for air. The world slammed into her senses. Bright, loud, real. She was back in the cold room. The metal cage was gone. The darkness was gone. But there was still a hum, a pulse. It was in the walls, in the air, in her chest. She was surrounded. She looked around, frantic. The room was unfamiliar, no stone, no metal. Just endless rows of machines, flickering lights, buzzing hums. She was lying on a cold, metallic slab. Her body ached, but she was free. At least, that's what she thought. But something was wrong. The pulse. It hadn't stopped. The machines, they were connected to her. She could feel it now, a link, a thread, a connection. Her heart raced, and the pulse grew stronger. In the corner of the room, she saw it. A figure, tall, shrouded in shadows, watching her. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But she knew. She knew it was the same figure. The same presence that had haunted her. "You're not free," it whispered, its voice cold as steel. Her chest tightened. She tried to scream, but the pulse, it grew louder, deafening. The figure moved closer, its form blurring in the harsh light. "You never were," it said, smiling. And then the lights flickered. The hum reached a deafening pitch, and the room began to close in again. Faster, smaller, tighter. The walls, they weren't walls at all. They were alive, pulsing, breathing. She could hear the heartbeat. She was no longer escaping. She was being drawn back into the dark. And this time, there would be no waking up. The world around her fractured. The hum, the pulse, it tore at her sanity. It wasn't just sound. It was an invasive force, wrapping itself around her very being. She could feel it pulling at her bones, tugging at her soul. The room squeezed tighter. The walls closed in like a vice, pushing her toward the center. Her breathing became shallow, desperate. She reached out, hands trembling, trying to grasp onto something. Anything, but there was nothing. The light flickered again, this time erratically, casting strange shadows across the room. The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes fixed on her. It was too close now. Her body trembled uncontrollably, a reaction she couldn't control. The figure's cold, empty grin stretched wider. "You belong here," it whispered. The words echoed in her mind, louder and louder, as if they were imprinted on her very soul. She couldn't escape. She couldn't run. The pulse surged, the beat growing more intense. Her chest tightened painfully, as if something inside her was about to rupture. It was impossible to focus. The sound, the darkness, the oppressive weight, it was all too much. The walls were no longer walls. They were faces, twisted, contorted faces, screaming, pleading for mercy. They pressed in on her, their eyes filled with the same emptiness as the figures. She screamed, but no sound escaped. She could feel herself losing control, slipping into the madness of the room. The shadows consumed her once more, not the ones outside her, but the ones inside her mind. The heartbeat continued, echoing through her, growing louder with each passing second. And then suddenly it stopped. A deafening silence. Her body froze. The pulse ceased. For the first time since she had woken, she felt stillness. But it was not peaceful. It was suffocating. Her limbs no longer obeyed her. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. All she could do was feel. And in that instant, she realized there was no escape. She had never truly woken up. She had only ever been asleep in the dark. And now, she was part of it. The stillness stretched on, unbearable. Her mind felt numb, disconnected from the world around her. For what seemed like an eternity, there was only the silence. But deep within her, a flicker of awareness began to grow. The sensation of being trapped, of being bound to this place, lingered. It clawed at her from the inside, a persistent reminder that she was no longer in control. But then, a small voice stirred inside her. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a whisper of something, hope or perhaps defiance. It called to her, urging her to resist, to fight. She felt her limbs move, almost of their own accord, a slow, tentative motion. Her fingers twitched. Her chest rose with a deep breath, a sensation she thought she had lost forever. The pulse, the beat that had once consumed her, faded. It weakened. She could feel herself, feel her own heart beating, steady and strong. The shadows that had swirled around her, suffocating her with their presence, began to pull away, not all at once, but piece by piece. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air seemed less heavy. The weight on her chest, the pressure, slowly began to lift. She looked around. The twisted faces on the walls faded, melting into the darkness as the light grew stronger. The figure, the one who had haunted her, disappeared into the shadows from which it came. She stood, shakily at first, but with growing strength. The room, the cage, the very space that had held her, seemed to dissolve around her. The coldness lifted. The walls became distant, fading into nothingness as the light enveloped her. The heartbeat slowed to a normal rhythm. She was free. The darkness was no longer her world. And though she didn't know what lay beyond the light, she knew one thing for certain. She had woken up, and this time she would never return